Welcome back to 417 Fox, your channel for the automotive DIY enthusiast. On today's video, we pick right back off where we left off on the last video, so if you missed it, you'll definitely want to click this card and go back and check out the priming and the blocking stage of this car as we get one step closer to paint. Now what we're going to be focusing on today is machine sanding, but I do want to share a couple of tips with you on block sanding as I finish that up. Now, I got my wife in here helping me out today. Say hi, Angel. As you've seen before with Peyton in here helping, my wife is phenomenal at helping with these cars. Actually, she is a key part to finishing these cars, so she's really good at block sanding when we're wet sanding and flat sanding out any of the orange peels. So she's my go-to person when we team up and do that. But before we get started, I'm going to take you through the steps of machine sanding after we finished everything in block sanding with 320 grit, and then we're going to take it to 400 grit machine sand, then to 500 grit, and then we're going to switch to 500 grit wet sand. And by the 500 grit wet sand, that's about 100 grit difference as far as actual abrasiveness on the car when you go with a wet sand, so that'll be very similar to just doing a 600 grit dry sand. Plus it gives a really slick finish, and it's not near as messy as it either. But before I get started doing that, I'm sure you guys are like me and you love listening to the radio while you work. Now Peyton got this for me for a gift, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it. He bought me an Amazon Alexa Dot. I love this thing. I did not realize I would till I brought it out here in the shop and hooked it up when I don't have to listen to commercials and all that other stuff. And when I get ready to work, depends on what kind of mood I'm in, I may listen to outlaw country, I might listen to Three Doors Down, I might listen to Metallica, whatever it might be. I love all genres of music. But today, I think I'm going to listen to some Three Doors Down. Alexa, play Three Doors Down radio. A couple little tips I wanted to share with you when you're blocking out your high build primer. There's a few different ways you can do it. Some guys like to go ahead and take it all from say 120 or 180. Now that's up to you on how to do that. I like to skip a couple of steps by not doing those steps. So if I can start at 320 and it cuts it just fine, 320 saves you a couple of steps. Now as this primer has been on here for a few days now, it has gotten a lot harder. So since it's harder and fully cured now, I've actually got to step down to 220 grit to get it broken in, to get it cut. So what I mean by getting it cut, that's opening it back up and go ahead and getting the texture gone with the 220. Then all you need to do with your 320 block is go and refine your 220 grit scratches. So this is turning out great, and all this right now we still got where you can see still a little bit of texture here. She's not quite done with all of that. I want to turn the light on here so you can probably even see it a little bit better. So you can see where your texture is here and here. But for the most part, she's got a lot of it. She's not been working on it too long, but she's pretty good at doing this sanding stuff. So once she gets done with that, she's going to switch over to the 320 paper, and she'll take her 320 paper and refine all those scratches, and then I will come over here with the 400 and go ahead and sand all this with the 400, 500 up to the 500 wet. So I wanted to share that one with you. The best thing to do is find what works best for you, because every different primer may act a little bit different. And if you try to get 320 out and it's not cutting into that primer, go down. If you take 220 out and it's not cutting into that primer, now remember, do buy some good sandpaper. If you buy cheap sandpaper, you're going to be fighting yourself. So better products when it comes to this kind of goods is what you want to stay with. But if 220 is not cutting it, jump down to 180. Woo! Well, I'm gonna tell you what, between my wife and I, we've got everything down to 320. Now it's time for the machine sanding part, because I don't know if my arms can take that much more. I'm sure glad I had her to help me, because it took me at least another day without my wonderful wife's help. I've been jamming out to some Brooks & Dunn and some Three Doors Down radio on my Alexa Dot, and it's definitely helped the time go by, but it's getting late in the evening. Now I'm getting ready to go ahead and start the machine sanding. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about machine sanding. Since we've taken this all the way up to 320 grit, now we need to go ahead and take it from 320 up to 500 wet. And to do that, I'm going to start with 400 grit. Now guys, I am going to put a link down in the description for this sandpaper. I can promise you this, you can get on eBay, you can get on Amazon and look for sandpaper, and you will find some that is super cheap. Do not buy it. I promise you. And I'll tell you that. Why did I tell you that? From experience. Look, so I'm going to have to admit something. I have got a Facebook Marketplace addiction. So I look for Mustang stuff, tools, you name it. I like to find it on Facebook Marketplace. There was a guy here locally selling another DA and a bunch of sandpaper. I'm like, whatever, it's cheap. I'm still not disappointed that I bought it, but it was like 40 bucks for everything. I'm like, well, heck, I can use that DA as a backup, but all this sandpaper. So let's walk over here and look at this sandpaper that I bought. I've tried it. Oh boy, did I try it. I'm talking about all kinds of sandpaper. I've got this thing, this here I've not used yet. It's supposed to be superior quality. Design. How about that? Design, not designed, design in USA. You just know that it's some cheap sandpaper. This is what I've tried, which was, I don't even know how to say that. It is junk. I tried to use this and it is junk. I'm gonna tell you, it's junk. Buy good sandpaper. I promise you. You can buy cheap sandpaper and 5 of those discs to one good disc easily. I use Sunmite, which is a pretty dang good paper. It's not as good as 3M, but it does last a very good while. So I'm going to start with 400 grit. Then I'm going to switch to the 500 grit. All along, I'm going to be using an interface pad. And what this interface pad does is prevent you from digging in with your pad on your DA. That's cool, because we don't want to shape at this point. All we want to do is refine the existing scratches. And then I'm going to finish it with a soft pad, a foam pad, which you can either use on your existing DA pad, but I prefer just to go ahead and stick it right on my interface pad. And we're going to go ahead and refine it with 500 grit wet, which will be very similar to doing a 600 grit dry. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and start the machine sanding part. When you're doing this, I've already went ahead and put the interface pad on. I've got my 400 grit on. You're not pushing down on this. You're letting the sandpaper do the work. I typically will do about 1 sheet per panel. So for this whole fender, I'll use 1 sheet of 400, and then I'll switch to the 500. I'll let the DA rest flat on these panels and let just the weight of the DA. I am not pushing down. Typically about 3 passes to 4 passes over each section will get you what you need when it comes to refining the scratches that are on there. So I'm going to go ahead and go over this whole fender with 400. Then I'm going to switch to the 500, and we'll go ahead and get that started now. You really want to keep this thing flat on these flat surfaces, and also be careful around your edges. You do not want to run this thing on these edges. You'll burn through your primer really fast. So you can always come back by hand and sand your edges anymore if you need to, or take one really quick pass with this, but be careful if you do, because if you leave it on there too long, you will burn right through the edge. Alright, I got my 500 grit on here. The process will be the same, so I'm not going to show you all that. I'm going to put it on time lapse. Then I'll show you when we get to the 600 grit where that'll be a little different since we're doing the wet sanding. Anytime I'm doing dry sanding with the DA, and I didn't for the first part of this video, I want to make sure you know, it's always best to wear a respirator. I always wear a respirator when I'm doing a DA dry sanding because it really stirs it up. And it's even really best to do it if you're even doing hand sanding. But this material here just falls straight to the ground. I'm not saying you still can't breathe some of it, but this stuff is not good to breathe. So always put a respirator on when you're doing sanding, and you won't have those awful sinus issues that this stuff will give you. Alright, so we got this thing down to 500. Now it's time to take it to our final sanding step, which is 500 grit wet. Or you could do 600 grit dry. That's up to you. Now what I like to do before I go ahead and take it to 600 grit or 500 grit wet, then I like to do what's called a wet check. So I'll go ahead and spray it. This is actually just water. Go ahead and wipe it down. And as you're spraying it and wiping it down, you can look right down that panel and see the reflection since it's wet. And I can assure you, you will see any imperfections that this panel may have. So I've just checked the top panel. Wax and grease remover were right. Oh, good Lord, I can't talk. Wax and grease remover also works very well, and it stays shiny a little bit longer than water. But that top panel, I'm going to tell you, wet, it looks like glass. So I'll check the other panels like this really quick. And just to make sure I don't have any problems, any sand scratches that would be any deeper than 500 grit sand scratches. At this point now, you really should not see any very deep straight line scratches from all of the blocking that was prior to this, because this, with the DA, you're actually putting circular sand scratches in it. Ooh, that looks good. This thing's straight. So go ahead and take my DA, get set up for wet sanding. I've got my Merca 500 grit wet pad. I've got my interface pad. I'm going to go ahead and put my interface pad on. Go ahead and get my 500 grit wet pad on. Now these things will last you a good while. They do not wear out like normal paper does. The way to keep these things to last is once you've finished with them each time, go ahead and wash them out, and you can reuse them for the next time. I like to keep a bottle of water. Squirt just a bottle of water on here, get it wet. Go ahead and soak the pad down really well. Kind of run it over, get the wet mixed up here. And you know, you're not going to cut into it real fast here, so the more time the better when it comes to getting this refined. Typically, I would say probably a good anywhere between 4 and 6 passes. Now I want to show you what this is going to look like once you've got it to where you're ready to put the sealer on this thing. It's going to have just a little bit of a sheen on it once you've done the wet sanding on it. get it good and dry here for you so you can take a look. Take the camera here real close so you can see. Put the light here on it. That's still the wet drying right there. Look how good that looks. So one other good reason to use a sealer, if there are any fine scratches that you may have missed during your sanding step process, most sealers will cover up any of those minor imperfections you may have left. Now, it's not going to cover up like a 60 or 120 grit sand scratch, but it will cover up maybe say a 320 grit scratch that you may have missed. And remember, since we're doing a metallic, you have to be extra careful to not leave any sanding scratches in this panel, because if you do, those metallics will find their way into that sanding grit, into that sanding scratch, and you will see that very clearly once clear is on the car. So I'm going to get back at it. I've got a ton of sanding left to do on this car. This is the only panel other than the hood that I have done the wet sanding stage on yet. So I've got tons of that to do. I'm going to come back with you and we'll kind of recap, and I'll show you what these panels look like. And I really want to show you what the car looks like once that roof has been wet sanded, because that car has been some work to get that roof really straight, and I'm really proud of how that thing has turned out. So I've got everything at this stage into at least 320. Some of it I've got into 400 like the car. So I'm going to go ahead and get after all of those steps. So I'll catch back up with you once all that is done. Alright guys, it's time for me to wrap this video up for today, but I'm going to come right back tomorrow and we'll finish this thing up. Didn't quite have time to get everything done today, but things don't always go as you plan, right? I was able to get both of the fenders and the cobra wing ready for sealer. So those are all the way up to 500 grit. Now everything else is either up to 400 grit or 320 grit. Still a lot of work left to do, but I'm going to tell you the hard stuff is done. All that blocking is done. Now we've just got a mess. Look at this wing though. This thing looks good, don't it? Look at these fenders. They got that satin look. They're ready for some sealer. These things are so smooth. There are no imperfections in these fenders. This car, this paint job is going to be so slick. I cannot wait to put some color on this car. It's like 10 o'clock here and I'm done for the day. I am whipped. Guys, I work a full-time job and I come out here when I get off at 5 o'clock. So I am done, and I'll get back to it tomorrow night, and I'll see you then.
Day 4.
Alright guys, I'm back. It's been a few days. It's been a lot of work. Every evening I've got out here and done some sanding. I also had some help from my wife getting everything sanded up, so it's definitely been a family affair out here. So what I'd like to do is take you through what we've done so far, and then I'm going to tell you what we've got upcoming in some future videos. Now, if there's any areas that you have burned through, and it's going to happen, you're going to just need to take that. Now, if I was going to use a DTM type sealer, which is the type of product we put on here already, I wouldn't have to worry about it so much because it would bridge the gap on any of the areas that burn through all the way to the metal. But I'm not. The sealer that I will be using will not be a DTM sealer, so I will have to prep those areas, and I'll walk you through what I've done so far. So here's the hood, and you can see any of these areas may have just a minor burn through on them, and that's okay. So what I've done, and I'll take you over here to the shelf, I used self-etching primer, and that's what I would put on it first and let that dry for at least a day. And then I just sprayed some primer sealer on there after a day, then I'll let that dry for a day. The thing when you do that is with this aerosol type spray is it's going to give a little bit of a gritty texture, and anything that you got overspray on the hood, a little bit of a gritty texture. So what I've done is go back over all of this with the 500 grit wet, and that got everything smoothed back out. You do not want to put this stuff on thick because you'll get a sag or a run really quick with that aerosol type spray. but it's just quicker for me to go ahead and address all those areas. All right, guys, I'm going to show you this roof. I'm very pleased with how it turned out. A lot of hours has been spent on this roof, and I cannot wait to show you how it looks. Look at that, guys. One thing you want to do when you're getting down to this stage, you always want to wet test it. And by either wax and grease remover works the best. Spray a little bit of that on there, and because it doesn't bubble up like water does when you spray it on here. And just look right down the angle of it, and you'll see if you've got any kind of imperfections. You shouldn't have. If you follow all the steps where you've used your flat block and you flat blocked your primer out, that would have showed if you may have had any low or high spots that need to be addressed, and then you would have fixed those then before getting to this stage of 500 grit. I've got to show you the hatch. It turned out great. This thing took a lot of work as well. Not quite as bad as the roof, but it turned out great. It's all wet sanded down to 500 now. Look at that. Straight, 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 straight. It's going to lay down like glass on here. So I'm going to wrap this video up, but I do want to tell you about some upcoming videos that we have coming next. So you probably are wondering, well, where's the Cervini's body kit? I've been saving that one. That takes so much different work compared to the work we've done on now. I've actually just brought them in, and we're going to record this today. My wife's helping me out. We're going to go through all the prep work of what it takes to get a Cervini's body kit or any raw urethane plastic body kit prepped, primed, and ready for paint. So we're going to go through that on our next episode. We've got our intake. We're going to put a GT40 tubular intake on here in an upcoming episode. I still need to roll the fenders for you. And then guess what? It's paint booth time. So I've got a 3-part video series where I have a modular paint booth that you're not going to want to miss. We're going to put that together, and then it's time to paint the car. So in just the next few weeks, guys, it's coming, and I can't wait. I'll see you on the next one.